we're back. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. We're doing History is Here to Help. And we're talking about a subject that most people, discuss at the dinner table almost every day. And that is chasing witches in the Renaissance. We don't do that in my house. The Scandalous Renaissance. We're going to talk about the Renaissance with Professor Jen McNabb of, Northern Iowa?
Northern Iowa. Mm-hmm.
Northern Iowa. And Carl Ackerman, who is a history and I guess a history professor from Punahou School, now retired, spends his time with us here at ThinkTech. We are so happy to have him on the show. Yeah. Okay, so let's get right to it.
Jennifer McNabb is a professor and head of the Department of History at the University of Northern Iowa. She received her PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder, following an MA from Bowling Green State University in Ohio and a BA from Adrian College in Michigan. Her teaching specialties include early modern European history and the history of England. Dr. McNabb has received several awards for her teaching and completed 3 courses for the Great Courses and Audible, which is online and really a tremendous accomplishment. And the subjects are witchcraft, the Renaissance, sex, love, and marriage in medieval and early modern Europe. She is currently at work on her 4th course. She has held service positions for a variety of places, and her scholarship on courtship and marriage has appeared in the 16th Century Journal, the Journal of the Wooden O, Women's History.
I didn't know they had journals in the 16th century.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Jay. You're okay. Jay, you got to be quiet while I
introduction. Jen, have we gone far enough on that?
You bet.
Okay,
wait, but I have to do the real momentous introduction. On June 21st in 1994, I was privileged to be a bodyguard for Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou has this kind of spirit that you can see. And she was presenting, and I was her bodyguard for the day. So I got to know her, and I was really impressed by her. But the same kind of spirit exudes from Professor Jennifer McNabb. And one time I was walking down during our history reading, which was in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was walking towards the Missouri River. And on the opposite side of the street, there was a woman walking across from me. And literally, Jay, I felt this vibe, this wonderful vibe about someone who was absolutely brilliant, who I'd seen kind of, I thought at the reading.
Maybe?
No, not at breakfast. That comes later. But anyway, but what happens is that I see her walking along the street, and I'm kind of wondering whether I should wave hello. And I put up this wave, and I got this, this nice wave back. And this is a woman who exudes brilliance, and I mean that quite sincerely. A very extraordinarily bright woman.
Let me check that out, okay, Jen. You need to wave back now. We can check.
Do you feel the aura?
There we go. But extraordinarily bright.
It was not something I had for breakfast. Yeah.
Okay, extraordinarily. You had bagels for breakfast, I know. Okay, extraordinarily bright, but also, as importantly, she was my boss, and I felt that not only was she a great boss, but I think she handles things very well, in all parts of her life.
One of the nicest things that I say about people, if I really want to compliment them, I say they are a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman. And maybe that's what we have here, you guys.
Right.
But I think we do have to define what we mean by Renaissance. Jen, tell us about the Renaissance. Is it all that it's cracked up to be?
Wow, what an opening. I don't know where to go with that. So Renaissance, as I teach it, I talk about it as a transitional period in history. We were talking before the show, Jay, and you mentioned the Black Death, the great 14th century pandemic. People often associate Renaissance as the next phase in Western development. We have a great disaster followed by a blooming, a rebirth of a consideration of what life is about, what is valuable, what makes a person well educated, what makes a people well governed. All of those questions were thrown into chaos by the Black Death and the Renaissance.
I'm thinking of Barbara Tuchman, A Distant Mirror, The calamitous 14th century.
Right.
Left a big impression on me in terms of history. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's an incredibly evocative work. I think it leaves a big impression on a lot of people. So I think that one of the reasons, certainly our fascination with Renaissance has changed in the last handful of years because we've had a calamitous pandemic ourselves. And the question is, where do we go next? We know what happened in the 15th century, a great flowering of art and literature and cultural developments, new ideas about citizenship. I could go on and on. I could give you the course. So it's a time of incredible development, as we were talking about, though, again, at the top of the hour. Not everyone had a Renaissance. Women did not have a Renaissance by and large. People below the level of elites did not experience the Renaissance that one sees in a textbook. So it had impact on certain portions of the population, but not everywhere. So it's a rebirth for wealthy, powerful men. But it's a significant rebirth nonetheless.
Well, you know, you asked the question, do you wake up one morning and get out of bed and say, oh, it's the Renaissance. What a nice day. Or is the Renaissance something that we only discover retrospectively? And that's a piece of history, too. Do we discover it 100 years later, or 2 or 3 or 4? How does that work?
Well, that's a fascinating question. Actually, the developmental arc of Renaissance as an historical period is a course in its own right, a subject in its own right. I joke to my students that no one woke up one morning and said, well, the Middle Ages are over. Welcome to the new age. People in the Renaissance wrote as though they were in a new age. In some ways, they wrote that age into existence. And I think there's a lesson in that. Many of the greatest Renaissance thinkers were tremendous PR men. They wrote themselves an age of gold. And then it was up to the historians to sort of look at the themes and patterns that emerged in the period that we now call Renaissance and see them as a more unified set of developments than contemporaries might well have been aware of.
Well, you know, is it all that it was cracked up to be, that it has been cracked up to be? Because if not, I have to stop calling people Renaissance men and women. There may be an edge on that.
No, I think the term is still a compliment. What we have emerge in the Renaissance is a marked departure in ideas about human achievement. And that's really the shining light for me of the Renaissance. If we look at a lot of medieval ideas about individuals' capability, the limits were low. Humankind was ruined and sinful. The Renaissance brings a new sensibility by studying the classical period, by examining works of philosophy, the pagan philosophers. This new quest emerges to achieve human excellence with an idea that is possible. One of the things I like most about the Renaissance is the emphasis that it put on education as a transformative force. This is the way. Man is generative. He can be what he wants to be. I'm ripping off Pico della Mirandola here. Man can be what he wants to be. He's just one level below the angels, unlike all of the other creatures who are set in their destiny. Man has the ability to impact his destiny. And I think that's such a powerful idea. And that's the legacy that really rings down from the Renaissance, is a celebration of human capabilities and human achievement.
Was the guy in the field, was he aware of that?
The peasant scratching a living out of the dirt, Monty Python style. So no, it would take a while for that sort of sensibility to sink in. And there are lots of things standing in the way of that. It's going to take centuries for ideas about equality and liberty to start delivering on some of the promises of the Renaissance, and longer than that for women.
Well, some people think we haven't gotten there yet.
Indeed. Indeed. But I'd like to think that we're Renaissance people, and that's where we're headed.
Yeah, free will. Anyway, we accept free will. And, anyway, now I want to go to the second term that's part of this intersection, if you will, and that is witches and witchcraft and chasing witches. And I'd like to know if, for example, witches were an invention of the Renaissance or they existed long before.
They predated the Renaissance, but witch hunting, it's one of these fascinating historical conundrums that we have this period that everyone associates somewhat too simplistically with progress in the Western tradition. We've got Renaissance. We're moving forward on all fronts toward modernity. The scientific revolution is playing out over some of this same period, and yet it's also home to profound episodes of witch hunting. How do we square that circle? Intellectual developments of the First Order and intense fear and superstition, all of that coexisting. I think it's a nice reminder that history doesn't happen in a single developmental trajectory. There are lots of fits and starts and forwards and back. So I think the witchcraft story is bound up in the Renaissance story. That's what makes history so fun. Everything is complicated.
Carl, are you writing this down because, you have to put it on the final exam?
Jay, anything that Jennifer McNabb says, I write down.
Carl, the check is in the mail.
I really have a disconnect on this because, I remember I wasn't there. Maybe I was in some sense in the 15th century. That was when they had the Inquisition. It was so brutal and nasty and mean. And, maybe it was a function of politics or social psychology, but that was bad news. And it was not enlightened in any way. And so how, you said we have to sort of reconcile. How do you reconcile the notion of witches, which is a horrible, nasty fiction, completely negative kind of image, with the Renaissance?
Oh, that's the $1 million question. So I think one of the things we want to focus in on is the idea that Renaissance, I nearly said unleashes, that's so dramatic, unleashes a lot of change into ideas about the world and the way people exist in it. Early modern folk, late medieval Renaissance people weren't always great embracers of change. Change makes people anxious. Change unsettles things. I think one of the things that's at the heart of witchcraft accusations is a fear of the unknown, a fear of things changing, disruptions to the status quo. And certainly the panic and fear that accompanied and really provoked witch hunting really was about a fear of the unknown, whether that's the unknown for the causation of harm and illness, losing your crops, seeing your livestock die, your sick child. That fear of the unknown could be displaced on a figure who seemed transgressive to the status quo, an outspoken woman, an older figure living on the margins of village society, improperly governed by a male authority figure. So there are a lot of threads to pull. I find witchcraft an absolutely fascinating topic of study because it's the perfect storm of a number of developments in the 14, 15, and 1600s that coalesce to do great harm for significant subsections of the population.
Well, I see a number of threads, including what you just said. Science, mystery about what they were doing and boil and trouble and whatnot. That was science at the time, and that represented change. Also, they were doing things that were outside the norm. And that represented change. But the other things I wanted to ask you about, number one, religion, because witches were counter to the established religious doctrine at the time. And the other I would like to ask you about is the political implication. In other words, Ferdinand and Isabella, they pushed on the Inquisition. Why did they do that? Not because they believed it, but because they felt that the hoi polloi out there wanted it. The people in the fields and the street wanted it, and it became a politically attractive position to take. So they did it. And this goes to the whole Tucker Carlson issue, doesn't it? You make a public statement, you make a public policy, but you don't really believe it. There's a dichotomy between what you believe, and what you do in public. And query, did Ferdinand and Isabella really believe it? The people who were pushing, witchcraft as a way to punish people and gain power, either in the church or outside, did they believe the poppycock they were selling?
Well, I think we have to go back and put this all into historical context. And the thing that I will say that I think will shed some light, such as it is light, it's dim, it's dark light. What we have in the late Middle Ages is an intense rise of concern about wrong-thinking Christianity, heretical Christianity. And this is going to loop back to your ideas about Inquisition. So some scholars have argued quite astutely, I think, that it's in the 1400s that we begin to see this synthesis of diabolic magic, drawing on the power of the devil to do harm, and sort of ideas about heresy. So witch hunting is born out of inquisitorial practices. If you look at the first witch hunting manuals, they have much in common with medieval inquisitorial manuals, because the idea is the witch is the ultimate heretic. And so you should sniff them out using the tried and tested tools that the Inquisition had already established.
Did they put that on the web? Was the manual on the web?
Sadly, no. But these manuals were distributed to the folks who needed them, the people in the field, not those fields, Carl, the ones who are doing the peasant work, but the inquisitors and the clergymen across Europe are reading these manuals, including Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, written by Heinrich Kramer. That is a book born of some frustrations from a failed witch hunt. And so Kramer set about to create this manual, witches and how to find them. And that's what he did. And so what we get out of that text is a lot of inquisitorial talk, but with the exciting fusion that witches had sex with the devil, that witches were lascivious women who were so driven by their lust that they would align themselves with the Dark One. So
you mean like Pizzagate? Also, let me say that I don't think this is a dead issue. I think we have witches, or the comparison of witches in today's times. And when Trump says it's a witch hunt, it's all a witch hunt, it's not just using the term rhetorically. He is referring back to the history that you are speaking of, where somebody gets to be the target. And then you bring all that manual in on him.
Right. And the other thing that, and you mentioned it in your comments, the other thing that's super important, I talk about witchcraft as a recipe. It's all of these ingredients that come together to form this sort of horrible sort of process in the Western tradition. I tell my students, there is no witch hunting unless it is a criminal act, unless the power of the state or the power of the church, but the power of an institution can stand behind it. That's how we have violence on the level that we see in witch hunting. And you can watch this cascade of criminalization of witchcraft happening in the European states. Monarchs are seeking power. And this comes back to an earlier dynamic in your comment. It's the age of the so-called new monarchies. So princes and kings and queens are looking to shore up their authority. One of the key things they are going to do is ensure religious uniformity. We can't have these ultimate heretics running around. But secondly, we can't have our subjects being harmed economically by witchcrafts, enchantments. I'm thinking of the Elizabethan statute against witchcraft, which has this string of terms that they're essentially criminalizing and outlawing. So the states have to have infrastructure enough to create laws that people thought were important enough in the localities to enforce. And it's that recipe that creates witch hunting of the sort that we see in the early modern European states.
So let me ask Carl, it seems to me this is all about scapegoats. A witch is a scapegoat. And of course, it's changed over the years, but in large part because of modern technology and the way society is ordered, to give the person who wants to capitalize on the notion of scapegoat much greater leverage than in the Renaissance. And query, is there a comparison, you think, between this notion of chasing witches and the Holocaust?
I think that, Professor McNabb can, correct me in this, but I think that the issue really is that you isolate people in your community. And, from what I've read, and this is where Professor McNabb can correct me, is that often, women who were unmarried and elderly in a village were those who were accused because they were the other. And, in Germany itself, I'm not talking about Poland or in the East in Russia, Jews represented 1% of the population, but they were highly visible. And so in the same way that these women who were ostracized in the village, I think there's a direct parallel in terms of keeping them in some sort of compartment as the other.
What do you think, Jen?
I think that's right. I mean, so one of the things that scholars have added very usefully to the discussion of witch hunting is distinguishing the size of the hunts. At the local level, they could target malefactors. They could target deviants in a local community. That's a nice way of a tried and true way of enacting some social discipline. But we also saw big panics, and everyone was swept up in those. To convict someone of witchcraft in the time period we're talking about, the gold standard was the witch's confession. For them to confess to these fantastical things that we look at thinking, well, there's no way they could have done any of this stuff. Why would anyone say this? Torture. The interrogation process involved torture in many of the European localities.
Oh, we don't have that anymore, Jen.
Well,
we don't have confessions in Eastern Europe. That's gone. And as for torture, that must be gone too, right? But what I'm saying is there's these threads you are describing.
Exactly.
This.
Exactly. And so we do have these episodes that are documented of people under torture naming names, anything that you could do, because that's what the interrogator wanted to hear. And it's fantastic, I have to say, to take students through this material, because they're making some of the same leaps that you are, Jay, saying, well, gosh, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The actors are different. The stakes are different. The topics are different, but many of the dynamics remain the same. To target the other. I talk to my students about this concept of othering people. It's much easier to enact violence, whether that's symbolic violence or real violence, when you don't think the person that is being targeted is the same person. that you are, has the same right to personhood that you have, or is wholly human. That's the destructive force that a variety of episodes in history have revealed.
Very troublesome. I can't remember the name of the town, but my wife and I were traveling in Italy, and we went to this sleepy little town in Italy, and there was nobody on the street. It was very quiet. It was a sunny afternoon. And then we found the torture museum there. And like everybody was in the torture museum. All the tourists were in the torture museum because it was so fascinating. In the Renaissance, they developed the science of torture. And they found and discovered all kinds of new ways to torture you. It's been with us for a long time. I ran into a guy at a legal convention not too long ago, and I said, "What do you do?" He says, "Well, I teach at Columbia Law School." I said, "What do you teach?" He says, "I teach torture." What? There is an art and a science and legal imprimatur about torture. This is very troubling because it got carried forward. And my question to you is, we know that in the 18th century, in these United States, there was witch hunting. Maybe earlier, maybe later, I don't know exactly when. Maybe you can speak to that. And that came over from Europe. We had that here. I don't know when it finally ended, but even in this country, we had it.
So students are fascinated by this. Everybody knows about colonial witchcraft, right? It's still part of the curriculum. What happened in Salem in the 1690s. There had been intermittent witch hunting activities in the earlier period in the 1600s. No really significant outbreaks. Salem is a real departure, and it is the exception rather than the rule when we talk about the American colonies. And one of the reasons things went off the rails in Salem was the shift in judicial procedure, in the proof of witchcraft, the allowance for spectral evidence, ghostly evidence that no one else could see, but that was accepted as proof. Things began to die off immediately. Accusations, continued prosecutions, would die off once they raised the burden of proof. So you talk about it as coming over with the colonists. So when did it end? The law on the books criminalizing witchcraft in England was repealed in 1736. They convicted their last witch in 1712, and then there's a gap. That makes us feel good. Hey, we're making progress. We're getting rid of this. Doesn't change belief systems overnight. Just as people didn't go to bed one night in the Middle Ages and wake up in the Renaissance, nor did they go to bed one night believing in witchcraft and wake up the next morning and say, weren't we misguided? Boy, we had that wrong. Beliefs among the populace, not the jurists, not the prosecutors of law, the beliefs among the people persisted into the 18th, 19th, into the 20th century. And as you mentioned earlier, in our own country's history, look at the satanic panic of the 1990s. That has a great deal in common with some of the vectors of witch hunting. So the ideas maintain themselves over time. I remember when I was writing my Great Courses series on witchcraft, this is the one that's out on Audible. I finished the final revisions on the last lecture the day my university closed for COVID in March of 2020. By that point, there was no toilet paper on the shelves anywhere, right? People were not their best selves because something great and unknown was coming. And it gave me a brand new perspective. As I looked back at the lectures I'd written for witchcraft, I thought to myself, it feels like we're living in one of these moments, fear and panic and loathing.
Yeah. Well, I guess, the question is, at least conceptually, witches haven't gone away. And you can find people who would accept witches as a concept, and also believe that some people are witches. By the way, is a witch usually young or old? Is a witch usually female or male? Can you have a male witch? We need to know this.
A man witch. Okay, so if we're talking about early modern witch hunting, the profile skews older female. There are exceptions to the rule. There were certain localities in which men were accused more predominantly, but by and large, it's approximately 80% plus female and older. And many of the other figures who were accused of witchcraft were connected to a dangerous old woman, to an outspoken, dangerous old woman. So there is a profile. That's the word I use actually with students. I say, let's talk about the profile of the witch. And there is one that's very easy to pick out.
It's really interesting. This is a very interesting topic. I want to come and audit your class. I hope you'll let me.
Love to have you.
Okay, so my last question is really my first question, and then we're going to let Carl ask you really tough questions, okay? Why do I care today in the modern world with all the things going on? Why do I care about this, call it cultural strain? Maybe it's a psychological, social strain in our human history.
Well, it's a question we've already been answering, so I appreciate that. I think that there are some universals in the way that people react to suffering, to the unknown, to fear of economic loss. I mean, that's another big factor in witch hunting. And we see some of the same patterns. To lash out at people who are different, to get sort of tribal, right? If I can invoke that term, to decide who's like me and who's not like me. And the people not like me, I think, are part of the problem. And we should do something about that, right? These conversations keep happening. They're not about witches mounting brooms to fly off to the woods to have orgies with the devil. Not often. But there are other things that have now stepped in to the same conversation. So I think it's so important. And when I'm talking, I did a witchcraft class this past fall with first year students here at UNI. And the way that I asked them straight out, why do we study witchcraft? Why is witchcraft important as an historical process? What does it mean to you right now? How does it help you understand your world? Best essays I have read in the course of a 20+ year college teaching career. I mean, they just got it. They saw in their world some of the same energies that drove witch hunting 400 years ago. And they all wanted to be change agents. They said, I can't wait until someone talks to me about witchcraft and they've got it wrong. It's stereotypes and prejudices. I'm going to tell them the way it was. You know, I'm going to talk to them about why that's a problematic interpretation. That was one strand of the responses. But another strand was, if we sit silently by and watch this kind of injustice in our world, we're part of the problem. You know, we're making this a reality. So if we want people to achieve greater equality, if we want to make our world a better place, we have to take action. We have to be empowered through our knowledge to do something. So incredibly gratifying to study the past, Jay. That would be my answer, because it offers lessons for the present.
History is here to help. That's what we say.
Exactly.
A couple of thoughts on what you said is, one, it strikes me that, you know, you don't have to have the term witch. You could find it in context all around. For example, high school bullying. Mm-hmm. That is, scapegoating, and ultimately the same thing as witchcraft. And sometimes it gets violent, even lethally violent. The other thing I wanted to mention is we had a show earlier today about Ukraine and about, the consequences of whatever happens, of the results in Ukraine. And one possible consequence, I'm sorry to say, is that there's no more democracy in Ukraine. It's over. And then you say, well, what happens in a place, a jurisdiction, a country where democracy is over, where there is no rule of law? And I suggest to you, Jen, that if there is no rule of law, you could have the same kind of thing that we had in the Inquisition. You could have these ridiculous confessions built out of torture. You could have the same things happen again, a low point in human development. Am I right?
Well, let's take it back to the Renaissance, right? I mean, one of the things that I hope in terms of bending the long arc of history is that we want to be better. We want to be transformed by the way that we approach the world, the human interactions that we have, our education, whatever that might look like, formal, informal. And I think that there can be resistance. We see that happen when people lose rights and liberties, that there is resistance against it, even in the most oppressive of regimes. But yes, it's an extraordinarily dangerous force unleashed to take democracy away, to take any kind of rule of reason away, leads to, I think, great tragedy.
Wow. Carl, go for it.
Professor McNabb, this is my time when I play Ed McMahon to Johnny Carson, where I am trying to summarize things. So if I don't get things right, you let me know. But I think we began with a discussion where Professor McNabb ended about the pandemic and how she realized that there were things that she now further understood. And then when she was defining the Renaissance, I thought it was really interesting that she focused on human achievement and it's sort of the new way of dealing with things and the possibilities for people. And I was so happy she quoted Pico, because that was sort of a statement made by a Renaissance man about what the Renaissance was all about. And then we kind of, Jay, because of your eloquent questions, we went on with a discussion of witchcraft. And Professor McNabb eloquently talked about her notion of profile, but also she said that she believed it was hooked to the new monarchies, meaning that witchcraft came about because of, especially in terms of legislation, because the new monarchs were searching for firm ground to stand on, and that was all part of the equation. In addition to isolating people the way we now do in contemporary life in certain incidents, where people who are the most vulnerable and on the periphery are those who are accused. And if I may add one thing to this discussion, is that in terms of historiography, I think most people, and Professor McNabb would know better than I, that Jacob Burckhardt in the 19th century was one of the first to use the term Renaissance, so that a lot of the terms we use historically are also, Begriffsgeschichte, the German term for, notion of using terminology at certain times in history, which creates this way of discussing the past. And I loved it when both you, Jay, and Professor McNabb were talking about the fact that no one woke up suddenly and said, "Oh, I'm in the Renaissance. I can be freer. I can be, and I can be a rock star, et cetera, et cetera. I can be a great painter." I always think that's a great thing. And obviously, Professor McNabb does a wonderful job explaining this to her students.
Do I get a minute for rebuttal, or are we out of time?
That was my next question, and I would have used that very word too.
And he does.
So a couple of really quick points that I think just elaborate on what Dr. Ackerman has said. And the first is that one of the things that's really great about Renaissance writers is that they were writing themselves a new unnamed age by distancing themselves from the period that they saw as their predecessor. They are starting to talk about a middle age that is distinct from the classical period. Today we still have this sort of trio: ancient, medieval, early modern / modern. The Renaissance helped us create that model. We're still living in that Renaissance mark of time because they were so intentional to separate. And this is where I'll go pop culture, as if you're both my students. I would say the Middle Ages becomes the Jan Brady of the Western tradition. Right? The ancient world, everybody loves it, Cindy. The modern period, the more mature of the older Brady sisters. But Jan, I mean, what do you do with the Middle Ages? And so my own students actually don't get that joke anymore. I'm aging out of my pop culture. But this period in the middle where things were less. And to stretch our analogy just one step further, no one went to bed one night saying, we're classical people, and woke up, oh God, the Middle Ages, we're medieval. What's happened around here? That is another long process. So we're in a developmental arc. We just don't know where that arc will go. And witch hunting I'm going to correct myself there. Witchcraft, beliefs in the power of people to wield supernatural power for good or for ill, had existed since ancient times, right? And in the Middle Ages, there was a pretty strong relationship between magic and the established church. That was a symbiotic relationship. But the rise of heresy and the dangers that it possessed, half pun intended, did really necessitate a rethink of the relationship between magic and the church. What happens is that witchcraft is not something that the new monarchs use witch hunting, identifying and prosecuting witches. They weren't allowed to peacefully coexist. Even the white magic practitioners, right? Because there were people who peddled in supernatural power to say, hey, got love troubles? I can help you with that. Did you lose some money? Got some misfortune? I can do a little thing that I do over here, help you find your lost coins or your lost valuables. Those people performed a service. In England, they were known as the cunning folk, right? Once the attack on magic is on, those people were caught up in the maw as well. So conclusively was the link made between magic and Satan. All supernatural power that people had could only come from one source, and that was the devil. So even the cunning folk were shut down. In some ways, they were considered a special form of danger because they thought they were helping. They led people astray through benign means. I mean, when someone is cursing somebody else out and then their limbs start contorting, there's no way to look at that and say, now I wonder where that power comes from. Could that be a force of good? No, of course not. But when someone appears to be helping, that's one of the devil's most subtle arts, is to lead people away from God in this more benign sense. So it's incredibly complex. We need many episodes to sort all of it out. So
while you're speaking, I'm thinking of all these things I'd like to ask you about, but we're out of time, Jen.
I knew that was coming.
When we come to your class and audit your class, I'll write it all down and see if I can ask you more questions. Professor Jen McNabb from the University of Northern Iowa, and of course, Carl Ackerman from Punahou as a retired history professor in Punahou. Thank you very much, you guys. This was really interesting, really and totally relevant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.